The Laundering, Volume 2, Case 07, The Credential Inside Cabinet. Canadian governments place figures with strong external sector reputations into cabinet portfolios where the figure's biography does the legitimizing work the institutional record cannot do on its own. Open the case.
The figure brings the credential. The institution keeps the conduct. The biography launders the record. This is the pattern, with three named instances: Guilbeault, McKenna, Carney.
Walk it, the figure and the file.
In November 1993, a 23-year-old Quebec environmental organizer co-founded Équiterre. He went on to become one of the most recognizable climate campaigners in Canadian public life. A decade with Greenpeace Canada's climate and energy team, the man who scaled the CN Tower in 2001 with a Kyoto banner, a household name in Quebec for sustained opposition to fossil fuel expansion. In 2019, he entered federal politics. In 2021, he was appointed Minister of Environment and Climate Change. He described the move as a continuation of his activism rather than a departure from it.
And then?
In April 2022, that minister, Stephen Guilbeault, approved the Bay du Nord offshore oil project, a Newfoundland and Labrador deep-water development expected to produce more than 300 million barrels of oil. In May 2022, Équiterre, the organization he co-founded, joined Sierra Club Canada in filing a federal court lawsuit to overturn his approval. The activist credential traveled from outside the government to inside it. The institutional conduct did not change to match it.
How the laundering works.
The mechanism is straightforward, and it does not require any individual to be acting in bad faith. A government carries an institutional record on pipelines, on emissions, on military exports, on indigenous rights, on foreign policy, that on its own merits would attract sustained criticism from the constituencies that follow those files most closely. Place into the relevant portfolio a figure whose biography is already known to those constituencies as one of their own, and the criticism becomes structurally harder to mount.
How the figure becomes the cover.
The figure's silence on a controversial decision is read as a sign that the decision must be more defensible than it looks, because that figure is not opposing it. The figure's defense of a decision they would once have opposed from outside is read as evidence of complexity rather than capture, because that figure is now closer to the file than the critic is. The biography functions as a permission slip the institution itself could not write. The figure may experience the role honestly. None of that defeats the laundering. The institution gets the benefit. The figure absorbs the friction. The conduct continues.
The anchor, Guilbeault and Bay du Nord.
On the 6th of April 2022, the Federal Impact Assessment Agency issued the decision statement. Guilbeault, as the responsible minister, accepted its conclusions. The conditions attached, including a requirement that the project achieve net zero emissions by 2050, were described by the government as the strongest environmental conditions ever imposed on a Canadian energy project. Guilbeault himself described the decision as the most difficult he had made in office.
And the founding organization?
Within 5 weeks, Équiterre and Sierra Club Canada filed in federal court to overturn the approval on the grounds that it ran counter to Canada's international climate obligations. Climate Action Network Canada's National Policy Director called the approval proof that having one of the most reputable community and environmental activists in cabinet was not enough to prevent oil expansion. Greenpeace Canada, Guilbeault's former employer, characterized it as a triumph of the politics that deepens the climate crisis. The activist's biography was a cabinet asset on Tuesday. The activist's founding organization was a federal court plaintiff against him on Friday. The project proceeded.
The comparators.
Catherine McKenna, Environment and Climate Change Minister from 2015 to 2019, entered cabinet from a public interest legal background. Her tenure included the Paris Agreement negotiation and the introduction of national carbon pricing. It also included the federal government's 2018 purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline system from Kinder Morgan for $4.5 billion and the 2019 reapproval of the Trans Mountain expansion. McKenna defended both decisions at the time. In a 2025 Toronto Star op-ed, she described the TMX purchase as a bitter pill she had come to regret.
And Carney.
Mark Carney, two-time central bank governor, Canada, then England. UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance from 2019. Vice Chair and Chair at Brookfield Asset Management from 2020, co-founder and co-chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero in 2021. By the early 2020s, the most credentialed climate finance figure on the planet. In 2025, he entered Canadian electoral politics and became Prime Minister.
And what he did.
In May 2026, his government signed a bilateral agreement with Alberta, laying out a timeline to advance an oil pipeline and weakening Canada's industrial carbon pricing system, while framing the pipeline as compatible with working toward net zero by 2050. The same argument Trudeau and McKenna had made for Trans Mountain in 2019. McKenna, asked about the new agreement in her capacity as chair of the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero, called the framing perplexing. The credentials did not change the conduct repeated with new credentials.
And the fourth instance.
Louise Arbour sits on a different credential vector entirely and demonstrates the pattern's reach beyond cabinet posts into the broader architecture of state appointment. Arbour's credential was built in international criminal law. As chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda from 1996 to 1999, she secured the first indictment of a sitting head of state since Nuremberg, Slobodan Milosevic, in May 1999, and oversaw the first international genocide conviction in the post-war era. She subsequently served as Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada and as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, 2004 to 2008. The credential is the most prestigious one a Canadian jurist can hold on the international file.
And the targets that were politically protected.
While in the High Commissioner role, Arbour did, at points, speak on the conduct of states that international criminal law was not politically available to pursue. In July 2006, she publicly warned that indiscriminate shelling of cities could amount to war crimes, drawing a direct public attack from the Israeli ambassador to Canada. In September 2007, she condemned Israel's designation of Gaza as hostile territory. On her exit from the role in 2008, a sitting Canadian Conservative MP called her a disgrace in the House of Commons, specifically in reference to her comments on the State of Israel. She had taken a real political cost for naming a protected target's conduct.
And then,
that was 2008. The post-2014 trajectory is observable. President of the International Crisis Group, Senior Counsel at Borden Ladner Gervais, UN Special Representative for International Migration. The Independent External Comprehensive Review of Sexual Misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, producing the 48 recommendation Arbour report. And, in May 2026, Canada's 31st Governor-General. The structural fact about Arbor's most recent decade is what the public record does not contain. Targeted searches return no substantive Arbor statement on Gaza or Israeli state conduct between the 7th of October 2023 and the Governor General announcement in May 2026. The credential that, in 2008, had been audible enough to draw a sitting MP's denunciation in the House of Commons was, after October 2023, not audible at all.
4 credential vectors, same operation.
Activist Guilbeault sued by his founding organization. Public Interest Legal, McKenna, defended TMX, regretted 7 years later. Climate Finance, Carney, new pipeline framed as climate action. International Justice, Arbor, sustained establishment trajectory, Governor General appointment in 2026, public silence on the file her credential is historically associated with for the duration of the post-October 2023 period. Different credentials, different files, different decades, same operation.
The vice-regal payoff.
The Governor General appointment is the structural payoff and merits naming on its own. The office of the Governor General is the vice-regal representation of the Canadian Crown. It is the institutional embodiment of state continuity, of the rule of law tradition, and, crucially, of the established order's claim to its own legitimacy. The Governor General is the figure in whose name prorogation is issued, military commissions assigned, royal assent is given, and the apparatus of the Canadian state declares itself the legitimate inheritor of its own conduct.
And what attaching Arbor's credential to that office does?
To appoint as Governor General a figure with Arbor's specific credential, Chief Prosecutor of the ICTY and ICTR, indicter of Milosevic, first post-Nuremberg international genocide conviction, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, is to attach the language and prestige of international criminal justice directly to the Canadian state's self-representation. The figure becomes the personification of the proposition that the Canadian Crown is on the right side of the international rule of law tradition. The proposition is made by appointment, not by argument. The appointment is the argument.
And the condition of the elevation.
This is the operation in its purest institutional form. The credential is generated in the prosecution of state actors that the international order was prepared to prosecute. The credential is then borrowed by the Canadian state at the moment when its own posture on Gaza, on arms exports, on the International Court of Justice proceedings against Israel, and on the wider question of Western complicity in protected target conduct is itself a live political controversy. The figure's silence on those questions during the relevant period is what permits the credential to remain transferable. A figure who had spent the 2023 to 2026 period audibly applying the same legal categories to Gaza that she had applied to Kosovo in 1999 would not have been appointable to the office representing the Canadian Crown in 2026. The silence is the condition of the elevation.
What the case claims.
The case does not claim Arbor was instructed to be silent. It claims that the structural arrangement is what it is. The credential's institutional usefulness on the most prestigious appointment the Canadian state is in a position to confer was contingent on a calibrated absence on the file the credential was historically authorized to speak on. The constituencies who built the credential's value across 3 decades of international criminal law work, including the Palestinian human rights organizations that wrote to her in 2008 to ask for further intervention and were heard, have not, in the period of greatest need, heard from her again. The credential proceeded upward. The file proceeded downward. The relationship between the two is the case.
The shape of the pattern.
Across the four instances, the structure is identical. A figure with substantial pre-political credibility in a particular external sector. Climate activism, international human rights law, UN and private sector climate finance, international criminal law, is placed into a federal portfolio or onto an appointment in the broader architecture of state representation that controls the file most associated with their reputation. Their appointment is received by allied constituencies as a substantive sign of seriousness. Within their tenure, decisions are made that, on the merits, contradict the position the figure was previously associated with. The figure publicly defends the decision at the time, often in language emphasizing pragmatism, transition, and difficulty. The decision proceeds. The institution carries the project forward under the credential's cover. Years later, in some cases, the figure publicly acknowledges, in lower-stakes settings, that the decision was harder to justify than they said at the time.
What the laundering requires.
The laundering does not require any of these figures to have been insincere. It requires only that their biography was useful to the institution they served, and that the institution's conduct on the relevant file did not, in fact, become consistent with that biography. The asset extracted is reputational cover. The price is the disappointment, sometimes the litigation, of the constituencies the figure came from. The institution pays the price in a currency that does not show up on its own balance sheet.
Scope. The file beyond climate.
The pattern is not climate-specific, although the three best documented Canadian instances all sit on the climate file. The same structure recurs wherever a portfolio carries a reputational liability that a credentialed from outside figure can offset. Foreign affairs and human rights, Indigenous services, justice and policing reform, refugee determination. Each of these files has its own version of the same dynamic.
And the file the case does not adjudicate.
The critique that surfaced the anchor argument raised an additional dimension worth naming, even though the case voice does not adopt its characterizations. The critique observed that Guilbeault, in addition to his climate record in office, was a cabinet member during the period of Canadian foreign policy decisions on Israel and Gaza from October 2023 onward, including arms export questions on which his pre-political activist persona would have predicted vocal dissent. The structural observation that an activist's public silence on a controversial cabinet position is itself a form of asset the cabinet extracts applies to the foreign policy file the same way it applies to Bay du Nord. The receipts on the foreign policy half are more contested in their specifics, and this case does not adjudicate them here. The laundering mechanism does not stay confined to one portfolio. It operates wherever the credential and the conduct can be priced separately.
What the case does not claim. The discipline.
It does not claim that activists should never enter government. The structural argument is not about whether the move from outside to inside is honorable. It is about what the institution extracts from the move, regardless of how the figure experiences it. It does not claim that any of the three figures named acted in bad faith. Guilbeault has stated repeatedly that the Bay du Nord decision was the hardest he made in office. McKenna has publicly and on her own initiative acknowledged regret about Trans Mountain. Carney's record will be assessed by historians on its own terms. The case does not depend on assigning motive to any individual. It does not claim that the three figures' policy achievements are nothing. The Paris Agreement, national carbon pricing, the regulations passed during Guilbeault's tenure, the GFANZ infrastructure, these are real, and a fair retrospective will include them.
What it does claim.
Canadian governments have repeatedly placed figures with strong external sector reputations into cabinet portfolios whose institutional conduct contradicted those reputations. The figure's presence in the portfolio operated as reputational cover for the conduct. The constituencies the figure came from paid the cost, sometimes in litigation against the figure herself. The institution kept the credential without paying its ordinary price. The three named instances, Bay du Nord under Guilbeault, Trans Mountain under McKenna, the Alberta-Ottawa Pipeline Accord under Carney, are documented, sourced, and structurally identical. The repetition is the case.
The figures may be sincere. The pattern is a pattern. Both can be true.
The laundering operates regardless. The strongest version is the version that refuses to caricature the figures or impute motive, and that refuses to pretend the pattern is incidental because each individual instance can be defended on its particulars.
5 statements true.
Guilbeault was sued by Équiterre over Bay du Nord in May 2022. McKenna defended the TMX purchase in 2018 and has since called it a bitter pill. Carney, in 2026, framed a new oil pipeline as climate action, and McKenna called the framing perplexing. All three figures brought external sector credentials into federal portfolios. None of those credentials prevented the conduct. All 5 are true. Their relationship is the case.
The biography launders the record.
And the record, looking back from the inside, becomes a bitter pill. By the time the figure can say so, the conduct is already past tense. The credential traveled in. The conduct stayed where it was. The institution kept what it bought.
Section 8. A worked instance. We charity.
This case names credentials sitting in cabinet. We charity is the moment one is spent. June 2020, the federal government awards We a sole source agreement to administer the roughly $912 million Canada Student Service Grant. No call for proposals to the organization that had spent years paying members of the Prime Minister's household for appearances. The reputational capital of a youth service brand converted, in a single decision, into a near billion-dollar contract.
And the recusals.
2 ministers, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, declined to recuse. May 2021. The Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner found the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, in breach of the Conflict of Interest Act. The Prime Minister in an apparent conflict, but not in breach. That is the transaction this case otherwise only implies. The point at which relationship as credential is cached. The full exhibit lives in Case 15. Case 7 is the cabinet side lens. Case 15 holds the evidence.